Hello, welcome to my section perspective tutorial. Today we're going to be making a section perspective out of this model we see here. So we're going to go from a fairly decent model, but it has some flaws that we're going to work through and take it from there to something like this, which will export the section out of Rhino. And then we will also render this section in Vray, and then we will take them and bring them together in Illustrator to ultimately create a section perspective that looks nice and clean and polished and gives a good understanding of the building sectional properties and as a bit of detail about how the program is used within. So let's jump back into Rhino and start from the beginning, and we'll get through all the steps to get to this at the end. So starting in Rhino, first thing I'm going to do is I'll delete this clipping plane so we can start completely fresh. So what we have here is our starting point. So this could just be any model you're at some level of resolution with and ready to make a section perspective. So the first thing I'm going to need to do when creating a section perspective is to try to figure out where I want to actually cut it. So the best way to do that is to create a clipping plane in Rhino. So I'm actually just going to go into my right-hand view, and I'll type the command clipping plane. Just draw a rectangle, doesn't matter what size. And now I'll go into my perspective view. Change that perspective back. So here we see our clipping plane, but as we can see, it's not really doing anything. So that's because it needs to be turned on in your active viewport. So I'm in my perspective view. If we look over here on the right, we can see that when I select the actual clipping plane in my properties tab, you can see that the clipping plane is not activated for the perspective view. So I'll click check mark here, and now we can see it is activated. It's cutting through my street here. And so what we can do is just really carefully select this and just move it through our building and get an understanding of the complete section of our building. So we can go all the way through and see how the stairs are working here. Come back, see how the center of the building's working, and then right up to the exterior where we're only looking at this little vestibule. So the first key element into creating a section perspective is to make a good decision about where you're cutting through. Typically you want to show the most interesting part of your section, but it's also important to have a lot of depth in your space. So for this section, we clearly want to just show these main living spaces. So somewhere right in here is what we're trying to show. So we can see this art gallery down on the ground floor, this like main office study space, and this interesting sectional relationship between the study and the gallery and the office and the study. Our living kitchen up here, and then our bedrooms on the back side, and our little carport also in the rear. But I don't want to just stop right here. What I'd like to do is, if I kind of look at this in plan, what I want to do is move this to an area that just is able to show all those spaces, but is also as far out as possible. So what I mean by that is right where we see here, we can still see all these sectional relationships, but I'm maintaining as much space in here as possible to add some depth to my image. If I were to just push this all the way over here, the fundamental understanding of this section is the same. All the spaces are the same, all the relationships are the same, but I've just cut my kitchen and living and my office in half. So when I render this, ultimately, it's going to read a lot flatter because there's not as much depth in the space. So what I want to do is pull this out as far as I can this way, where I'm just inside the wall to actually see the relationship. Right here, I'm actually in the space and I can see the relationship, but I haven't gone too far into here where I'm just deleting in context, but not changing the actual understanding of the section. So I'm gonna just we'll leave this right about here. So this is a great spot to take my section perspective. The next extremely important thing is setting up your view. So what I want to do in this section perspective, there's a number of ways to do this. There's the more typical straight-on section perspective where you essentially want to keep this where you're only seeing sectional information and you're kind of even with it. It's important to keep your horizontals completely horizontal here, so you can see all my floors are horizontal as opposed to here where they're kind of angled. This is one way to do it to show the inside, but what I want to do here is I want to show a little bit of exterior as well, because I want to show a little bit about the relationships between the interior and the exterior on this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just angle this slightly. So I want to come in somewhere right about here where I can see a little bit of how the front facade's working and how the window relationship is to the interior, but I'm still preferencing the entire interior section of this. So I just have a little bit of a rotation off of a perfectly straight section to understand how my facade works as well. The next important thing to consider is your height, right? So I don't want to be down here because I'm putting all the preference on this one room. I'm not really getting a good reading of what's happening up in the upper floors. So for sectional perspective, I typically like to hover somewhere in the middle of the building. So right now, I can see that I'm in the middle of the building because on my middle floor, I can catch a little bit of ceiling here, but I can also catch a little bit of floor. So then the floor is preference on the ground floor, and the ceiling is preference on the top floor. The middle floor is getting a little bit of both. I don't want to be right here, right, where I'm seeing no floor here and no ceiling here. It makes it a little bit confusing. Just coming up a little bit to make sure that on the middle floor where my camera is, I see floor and ceiling will help this read a lot more clear. So as soon as I have a view that I like, and I'm going to just go to my pre-saved view, and you can see I went to this pre-saved view and I lost my sectional information. I can just click the clipping plane, turn that back on, and make sure that's there. One thing that's important to do is when you do find your view you like, to make sure that you change your projection to a 2-point projection. This will ensure that all your verticals are in fact vertical. It'll make Linework cleanup easier in the end, and generally as a nicer composition. So I have my view saved. I have my section in the correct spot. I can see a lot of interesting things. Of course, there's still a little bit of mess inside my walls here from some sloppy modeling earlier, but that's good because I'll show you how to clean that up and make that nice and clean later. But this is generally a good composition to start to look at. So if I just look at this in rendering mode, so you can start to get a slight idea of what this is going to feel like ultimately, and it's starting to feel pretty good generally from composition. Everything's aligning well. I have no funny, like, confusing overlapped areas and so on. So we'll call that good. Now I want to set this up to create a rendering of it. That'll serve as my underlay for my hybridized line drawing. So from a rendering standpoint, I'm going to go into Vray, and if you haven't seen my previous rendering tutorials, now's a good time to jump into those, because those will kind of get you up to speed on the settings that I'm using and how best to light the scene for a rendering in general, and what I'm going to do to sort of modify those generic settings that I set up as my typical go-to for any standard exterior scene. So what I do to change those is I'm going to go into my light settings here. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off my Rhino sun here. It's already off, but so typically this Rhino sun's on. I'm going to turn it off. And the reason for that is because I don't want the sun to be coming in through my section perspective and giving a sort of false sense of lighting, right? So if I were to have the sun shining in here, it would be a lot brighter than the space really is because I've removed the entire east wall from my building. And that's sort of not realistic. And I don't want weird shadows happening in a way that doesn't match what only the windows would do. So what I'm going to do is have my HDR serve as my primary lighting, and that's going to give a more atmospheric effect, and it's also going to just kind of give some subtle gradients to my my walls and interior objects. So the HDRI, which I show you how to set up in my exterior lighting tutorial. So the only difference that I'm doing here is I'm actually upping the intensity to 2 rather than 1, which is my standard. That's just going to give me a little bit brighter on the inside. The other thing I want to point out is that my dome light, which is using the HDRI here, is represented by this arrow. If you remember from my exterior lighting tutorial, this arrow points to the sun in the HDRI, which is in the center of the image. So I've just rotated this so that it's pointing to the outside of my section perspective. So if this is my section, my cut line here, looking to my left, this is pointing to my right, so that the brightest part of my image is pointing back onto my interior spaces. So because it's an HDRI, it's just going to be a really subtle, diffuse light that brightens up the scene, but doesn't give the same effect of sunlight coming through. So just subtle changes in my typical render settings, up the intensity of the dome light, make sure it's pointing opposite my section cut. I don't want it pointing this way because then it's just going to make it really dark in here. I've turned my sun off because I don't want any sort of false shadows coming through. I could have my sun coming from the southwest here and coming in so that it's not creating any false shadows, meaning that if it's coming from this way and it hit a window and then have a shadow come in, that could be okay. But I think from the point of the section perspective, really the line work is going to do a lot of the work here, and the rendering is going to serve as just an underlay. So I don't need to get too carried away with trying to get the sun calibrated just right. I'm mostly just focused on my HDRI, which I'm using through the Vray dome. As far as my typical settings, nothing fancy here. I'm going to put this on low just for the sake of time. But one thing is important to make sure is that your aspect ratio is set to match viewport. This will be extremely important here because we're going to also make a 2D drawing of this that also needs to match that viewport so that we can align them nice and easily in Illustrator later on. So everything else here is my typical render settings. So let's now go to my section perspective view. Make sure that's still set to section perspective. Make sure the section perspective, the clipping plane is actually activated. And let's now hit render. Before we do that, one thing I will point out is that most of these materials you can see I've created is just a sort of simple solid white. I didn't want to go in here and put in hardwood floors or concrete floors and have green plants and kitchen cabinet fronts and all of that, because again, this is really going to be more about the line drawing, and all of this is just going to be sort of shade and shadow backdrop. So I changed all of my materials are essentially set to this interior white wall flat, which is a super boring material. It's literally just set the diffuse to like basically white, and I have no reflection, which you can see my reflection is set to black here, no refraction, nothing fancy about it. It's literally just the generic V-Ray white. And that's just going to simplify everything. I do have glass, still add glass, so you can see through it here because I do want to be able to see through my windows and kind of see into this carport a little bit. Beyond that, almost everything is white. And my exterior materials are still set up. You can see this kind of orangey here. And I have some brick on here, which isn't displaying for whatever reason, but we'll see it in the rendering. So now that I have that set up, let's go ahead and hit render. All right, so now that it's finished up, we can see, again, very simple on the interior here, just kind of matte white for most everything, and then some exterior information. You can see the brick and the windows and, you know, some of this metal and board form concrete. One thing we'll notice is that the insides of the walls where the section cuts are a little bit of a mess, right? You're seeing like weird brick in here and all kinds of like mess here, and then some like weird brick here. This is simply just, you know, the way I built the model, and some materials got on wrong layers and a little bit of sloppy modeling, which, you know, happens when you're doing design iterations. So I wanted to leave those in there because we're going to work our way how to clean it all up, and also just to kind of point out that anything that's in the section cut is just generally not going to matter because we're going to be filling that in Illustrator in the end. So we'll go ahead and make sure to save this image. And one thing I want to point out is, so we'll save it as number 2. It's important to make sure to save the material ID as well. So I'm going to just change my option to material ID. And you can see this is just sort of all the different rendering materials are shown in block colors. I'm going to save that as well. O2 material ID. This will help us in Photoshop just sort of do a little quick touch up. One thing that I typically do is if you actually just do this, click and hold the save icon and go to the double icon, that'll save all the different channels. And just a quick reminder, if you follow the exterior lighting tutorial, or some of my early Vray tutorials, I talk about how to set up Vray so that you're actually outputting this material ID layer. So be sure to check that out. So now that our rendering is done, we have that as a backdrop. What we need to do now is get our line work out of here, which is going to be the sort of main part of this hybridized drawing. So to do that, I'm going to make sure I'm still in my section perspective view. I haven't changed anything. All of my layers are unlocked that I want to use. I'm simply going to select everything that I can see. So just far right hand corner over here. So now I've selected everything in my view, and I'm going to go to Dimension, Make 2D Drawing. I'm not going to get too fancy in here. I'm just going to leave my projection at view. I'm going to have my options as maintain source layers. But I do want to check this box for viewport rectangle. That's what that's going to do is when it does a make 2D, it's also going to just draw a line that represents the aspect ratio of my particular window. And that way I can use that line to match the rendering when I overlay these, because my rendering is also matched my viewport. So I have two things and they should perfectly align, so I don't have to fuss around trying to get all of these lines to perfectly match the geometry. So let's just hit OK here. It might take a minute. All right, now that that is finished, without touching anything else, I immediately want to go to my top view. So I'm going to double click on my section perspective view and then double click on my top view. So you can see it made 2D in my drawing. It also, everything is selected currently that I use. It also has the clipping plane selected, so I'm just going to deselect that. But so I want to make sure and move this away. So every time you make 2D, it'll bring it in right to the origin at 0, 0, 0. So if I were to just leave this here and then do something else and make 2D again, it would come right on top of it, and then it'd just be a mess because all the lines are on top of each other. So every time I make 2D, I immediately go to my top view and I move what I just made. So I'm just going to move this way off here. And so let's take a look at what we got out of that, right? So we can see our section is cut here because I'm seeing inside the building. We can see a lot of messy lines and some confusing things here. This is sort of the hardest part of making a section perspective. And I don't think it's actually difficult. I think it's just a little bit time consuming and a little tedious, but I think this is really the most important part. There's no magic button to make a beautiful section perspective out of Rhino and Vray. It is sort of making the separate pieces and overlaying them all. And what's important is you as the designer and as the artist here is to use these moments that you're sort of taking your own manual inputs away from the computer to make sure you stylize these correctly and make them read properly and really inject your own sense of style to these, but also to make sure that whatever you're trying to convey in here architecturally is still coming across. So what do we have to do to make this essentially look like this, right? First thing is we need to kind of run through and clean up all of the stuff that's in the section cut. So what's in the actual floors and walls? So if, this is a lot easier when you understand your own model and what the spaces are. So it's very clear that this is my floor here and that all of this kind of junk in here needs to go away. So I'm just selecting and just deleting all this mess in here. That it was important to make 2D because those lines existed in my model. So Rhino just makes 2D. Rhino doesn't know I'm making a section cut. It just knows where there are lines and where there are not lines. So, but I know that those can go away. And then when I come up to the section cut through my kitchen here, I sort of have to, use my understanding of the section to cut away at the parts that I know that are not going to be there. So just using trim, I'm going to trim out some of these pieces and I'm going to delete some of these and just trim away what should be there and what should not be there. So that essentially you're reading the section cut of the toe kick, that's the base cabinet up, then to my upper cabinet. You wouldn't see that line because that's inside the wall. Coming out here, coming back, coming around, and to the little soffit here, and then up to my ceiling. So I've just kind of cleaned out all the mess that is inside the actual section cut. So I just work my way around the building. And when I get to sections where the floors meet the walls, I just type TR for trim, select everything, enter, and then just cut away the inside stuff. Then it's starting to look more like a nice clean section cut, right? And you just kind of work your way around the building, coming through, deleting all those interior pieces that you wouldn't see in the section cut. After you've run through all of that, and it is important to be careful and tedious, even when you get down to these window frames, right? This will all make your final output a lot better if you do take some time and come through and really be diligent about cutting through all these pieces. In preparation for this, I did this one. It only took me about 30 minutes to get through and really clean it up, so it's not as bad as you think. Just kind of run through and think about what should be aligned and what should not. And so that goes for the exterior as well, right? So like this is a perfect example. Like, what is this? This is not a part of my building. This was a part of my Rhino model because in a previous iteration I had a window here, but then I decided I didn't want one, so I just put a surface there. But if we look at the model itself, right? So here, this surface, this was just a little infill when I changed my mind and that window wasn't there anymore. But because I had a surface here and a piece here, and it wasn't a nice clean geometry, which is typical when you're in design mode and you're kind of changing things, it still made 2D of that because Rhino just realizes that that's just a surface line. But because it rendered, if we go to the rendering knows that this is all one thing because it's all set to the same render material and at the same scale. So you don't see those lines here. It just all reads as brick. So I come in here, all I have to do is just delete the lines that aren't supposed to be there. And some lines like this, because this was two different surfaces, I need to delete those as well. and just kind of work my way through the facade and understanding my own model and knowing what should be there and what shouldn't. And I can essentially work my way through all those unnecessary lines in here so that it reads as more a full clean face here. Same goes up here in this pilot house, right? This is just a quick modeling thing where that was just a block on top of this wall. So I just need to come in here and delete that because that's all actually one surface, right? And all of this is one surface from there to there to there and there. And now it's reading a lot cleaner. We're only seeing the exterior surfaces and not any of the unnecessary lines that were just sort of left over from modeling. So once we go through and clean all that up, the next step is to get everything on the correct layer. So my goal in doing all this work in Rhino rather than Illustrator is to have all the drawing, all the layering, all the line work set up so that when you go into Illustrator, you're really only just changing the stroke weight and then playing with a little bit of transparency, and that is it. Adobe Illustrator is a great program, but I personally despise drawing in it, and I don't even particularly like editing that much in it. Using architectural software and drawing software like CAD and Rhino, I've become accustomed to the shortcuts and the ease of like drawing polylines and connecting them and trim and extending, all those typical commands that you use when you're drawing in an architectural program. Adobe Illustrator doesn't quite work the same way, and it's a little bit more cumbersome. So what I like to do is do all my drawing in Rhino and then just bring in Illustrator. So the first thing I would do is go to my layers, and what I'm going to do in my Make 2D section is make a few layers that are going to serve as my Adobe. They're basically going to represent different stroke weights in Adobe. So I'd make a layer called Outline, and these layers wouldn't be existed. I've already made them in this tutorial, but you'd have to make new layers. So make an outline layer, make a heavy, medium, and a light. You can do an extra light if you want. I think, and for this example, I don't think I'm going to need it. So just a light, medium, and heavy, and then an outline, and that's it. I'm going to keep this very simple, right? There's going to be 4 different line weights in my final output. And it'll be easier to keep those apart. I'm going to change my layer color of all 3 of them so that it's easier when I'm drawing it. And then I'm just going to use my existing drawing to sort of trace over it for part of it. And then I'm going to just select different parts of it and put them on the correct layer. So, but before I do that, I'm just going to select everything and just throw it on light, because most of the stuff is going to end up being on the light layer, especially all that detail stuff. All of this furniture and this plants and these books, we don't want that to read really strong as a line weight. So we're just going to throw that on light, and we're going to call it light as like the main starting point. And then everything we build up on top of it is going to be heavier. And then therefore, if there's a line on top of a line, the heaviest will show. So it doesn't matter since everything's going to be on light. So the first thing that we want to draw on here is the outline. So I'm going to make that my current layer. And then I'm just going to type PL for polyline. And I'm going to just trace what is actually the section cut. So again, all of this little stuff should be cleaned up by now, but I'm just going to start this for time reasons. And what I can do is just follow along where I know my building got cut. So I know it goes up here to the parapet and down, and I know it goes right in here to the window. I can just simply follow I'm just basically tracing my building. It goes all the way down here to the basement, all the way over, up here to the carport. It wouldn't stop here because that's exterior. I'm only concerned with my actual building envelope. And then back to the beginning, C for close. So that's sort of like the main outside of my building. And then I have to come in and fill in the interior lines. So I'll start in the living space. Again, I'm just tracing what is being cut. So I know it cut through my window. I know it cut through the window frame. I know it cut through my floor. I know it cut through my kitchen. And I would typically be a lot more careful with my drawing here, but for the sake of time, I'm just kind of cruising along. Then I have my bedroom here, so that room is pretty simple. And I just kind of go room by room, starting in a corner and working my way around and filling out the spaces. You can already see it starts to feel more like a section cut perspective, right? When you like clearly define what is the cut and what is not. Again, all this stuff should be cleaned up by now. The next layer down is my heavy line. So for this, what I want to do is trace my exterior building envelope. So what I mean is sort of like these lines that run around the exterior. So I kind of come around here and just whatever's the farthest extent of my building. I'm not going to follow this that closely. And just trace over here. Then I'll continue here, trace down. This is just sort of differentiating my building from the context to help it pop a little bit in the end. I'll come down here, follow my little scoop around, and take that here to the main piece. And where else? A little bit over here. So all the parts of my building that are on the exterior but I still want to like define as part of, I want them to pop a little bit from the context. Then the next layer of detail is the medium layer. So this is going to be, rather than tracing, I'm probably just going to select a bunch of stuff and then change it to the right layer. So the easiest way to think about what the medium layer is, it's all of the inside corners, or it's just all of the spatial corners is one way to think about it. But not any detail. So when I look down here, this art gallery space, all of these big defining spatial features here, I'm just going to select all of these. I'm also going to select all of my like floor to wall lines, because all of these are big spatial defining features. Also this stair, right? So this stair, I'm just going to select the main edges that build the stair. And sort of define it as we move up. All of these things I'm going to select, and even this like sort of built-in desk thing, just the main edges of it all. Some of this stuff would be on the actual section cut layer. I'm just going to select all of these, and I'm going to put them on the medium layer. So again, just to kind of reiterate, so like up here on my main living floor, it'd be this crease right here. So it's just like, where does the geometry turn? And then I come down here, the edge of my kitchen, then this wall up here, this corner here, this opening here that opens up to the light well, this interior corner of the bedroom coming down to here, all of this stuff goes on the medium layer. And then what's left is the light layer. So the light I think of as all the detail, right? So what I did here is I would select the main geometry of the kitchen goes on medium, but the detail of the kitchen goes on light. So the main spatial features of all of this goes on medium. The detail all goes on light. All the furniture is on light. On the exterior, I would select basically the opening of the window goes on medium, but the window frame and detail and glass, all of that stays on light. So again, the opening of this window, just select all those lines, put that on medium, but leave the window frame and the glass and all those lines on light. And I'd work my way around. That line's not supposed to be there. This is a line. There's a little reveal right here. That would go on medium, because you can see that it's like an exterior geometry switch. These are all just messy lines that aren't supposed to be here. All right, so again, I just gonna select these, the like main break and plane here, put those on medium. All right, and so I'd follow that all the way around, all the main geometry. Take all of that, put it on medium, follow that all the way around, and everything else is left over, ends up on light. So if I do this very carefully, again, I did this all, it took me maybe 30 minutes. This is what you'll end up with. So you can see my outline layer shows the section nice and clear. My heavy layer kind of defines the building in the whole composition. The medium layer shows all my major plane changes within the drawing. And then my light layer is just all the fun detail that like fills it all in, right? It's, the PV panels, the fan, all that kind of stuff. And so at the end of the day, what I'm left with is this. I also made an outline layer that kind of defines the section cut of the context as well, as sort of a separate line. And so what I've done is I've taken my whole drawing and reduced it to 4 simple layers that really define a level of detail. And we're going to use that and export that and bring it into Illustrator to overlay it with our rendering. So let's select this, and we'll go to File, Export Selected, and we're going to change our save file type as Adobe Illustrator, and we'll save it as section perspective Linework. I'm not actually going to save it because I've already done that. So you'd hit save here. So we have that. And we remember we have our rendering. We saved our rendering. We've saved our material ID of our rendering. So now let's start to hybridize all these things. So there's a few more steps to bring this all together and really make it shine. First, we're going to go into Photoshop because my general rule of thumb is that every image you ever present should always be photoshopped to some degree. Nothing's ever going to be perfect out of Vray. And there's a couple things we want to do just to really bump this up a notch before we take it into Illustrator. So I have my output here. I also have my material ID here. I'm just going to duplicate this layer, right click, duplicate layer, change it to my main render layer, click OK, close this. Now I have my material ID and my my Vray output on the same file. What I want to do here is, so you can see this is the HDRI in my background that renders with it, which is fine. But I don't really want that to stay. You can see there's a seam here and some weird things. I typically prefer to bring in my own sky to Photoshop. So I'll just go to my material ID. I'll select the ground and the sky using the magic wand. Go to my main layer, Control X to delete that. So now I just sort of left with the main building. The other thing I'm going to want to do is just play with a little bit of brightness and hue and saturation. So image adjustments, brightness. I'm just going to brighten this up a little bit. I'm going to up the contrast just a little bit. Image adjustment, hue, saturation. I'm going to lower the saturation just a hair to get, so it's not too orangey and yellowy, and keeps those whites a little bit wider. Click OK. So that's starting to look a little cleaner. The other thing I want to do is I'm going to now add a sky here. So file open. I'm just going to go to a bunch of skies I have saved. You can find free skies anywhere online. I have a couple that I like to go to, which I think I actually found some free package online. Copy, paste that in, zoom out a little bit. Just gonna flip this a little bit. I think it's a little better from the, there we go. Again, just trying to make the scale of my sky match my image. So it feels right. It's a nice composition, something like that. Feels pretty good. I might play with the brightness of that sky a little bit. Brightness, contrast. Maybe do a little bit of a photo filter. It's feeling a little blue. Warm that up a little bit. Sure, that looks good. So something like that. So nothing too crazy in Photoshop. I don't need to go crazy here again. This is going to be about line work. This is all going to be an underlay, and it's going to get a little bit washed out. So don't worry too much about it, and also don't worry about all this mess in here, right? Because we're going to come back and we're going to take care of that in Illustrator. But I generally have a good matte white drawing. Another good Photoshop trick while we're here is if you go to image adjustment, shadows and highlights, what this does is it takes the shadows, will brighten the darkest darks or darken the lightest lights. So some of these dark spots here in the back, I'm just going to bump those up just a hair. So you can see when I move this, like the street changes because that's dark, but also the dark parts in here. My light parts don't change that much. It's only just bumping up the darkest parts. So I'm going to bump that up to like 20 and just click OK again. So here's back and forth. It's subtle, but it just gets a little brighter in there, a little bit more even. And now that that is ready to go, I will save it as a JPEG. So save as a JPEG. You can see I already saved it as edit here. So we'll call it whatever you'd like and save. Not going to do it. And so now that that's ready, now we can go into Illustrator. So again, here's our final product here. This is what our goal is. But we're still a few steps away from there. So let's go ahead and first we'll open the JPEG. We're not going to open the line work first. Make sure you open the rendering first. So open, here is that edited JPEG that we took our straight Vray render, brought it into Photoshop, added a sky, brightened it, desaturated it, not that much. I'm going to open that in Illustrator. So here it is. You'll notice that my my artboard is way too small. So this is the actual size of the rendering. This is like probably an 8.5 by 11 artboard. So first thing, I'll go to document setup, edit artboard. I'm just going to drag this out so that I make sure my whole project is actually in the window here. Oops. I like to give a little bit of a border too. Oh, oops. I clicked something weird. Sorry, I made a new artboard on top of that by accident. There we go. Click escape, and now, so my whole project is actually on the artboard. Now I'm going to go to File, Open, and I'm going to go to my section perspective line work. So this is just straight out of Rhino, nothing done to it. Click Open. And so we can see it here. If we look over here at our layers, we can see that we have the light, medium, heavy, and outline, which is great. What I want to do is now copy this over into here, but one thing that it's important to double check, and this is not the default in Illustrator, but once you change this, it'll always be that way. If you go to your layer tab here on the right, there's a drop down, and if you click this 3 lines as a drop down, there's all these options. See right here, it says paste remembers layers. I have that checked, and once you check it once, it'll stay like that on your personal computer always, but it's not the default. So make sure that that's checked, And here's why, because when we come through, and I'm going to Control A to select all of it, Control C to copy, come back here, Control V. Once this comes in here, not only is it all my lines in this thing, it brought all my lines on the right layers. If I were to not have that, it would bring all these lines and they'd all be on one layer, which would just defeat all that work we did on putting them on 4 distinct layers. So now that they came in here, they're all on their own layer. And while I still have them selected, I am going to move them right over here to the corner. I'm going to zoom in nice and close. And I'm going to move these over until it kind of snaps right on that corner there. And then zoom way out so I can see the far corner. I'm going to grab my rectangle here while holding Shift so that I don't change the proportions. When I hold Shift, it stays the same. I'm going to pull it all the way out until I hit the other anchor point here. And we can already see that all of my line work perfectly aligns now. And so if we remember back when we made 2D, we made the viewports. That's the viewport. We rendered it, we matched the viewport. It's because those are the same. I know I just need to scale this and it snaps in Illustrator, and now all my line work perfectly aligned. But first thing you'll notice is it doesn't look very good. It's weird. Why is it red? It's not supposed to be like that. So now let's just do some quick, simple things to get that line work to pop. I'm going to lock my layer 1, which is my rendering. I don't really need to play with that at all. I'm going to select all, Control A. And for the first thing I'll do is change my stroke color. So you can see the color has little question marks with a bunch of different colors. We'll just change that to black. So already looking better, right? We have all black lines. The other thing I do when I select all, I'm going to change my corners to sharp corners, like a miter joint. Just it's very subtle, but it makes a big difference. Rounded corners don't look as good. So black lines with mitered corners. Now what I'm going to do is first thing I'm going to change the order of my layers. I want the heaviest to the lightest. So I'm just going to grab the outline, which is the heaviest, and just kind of drag it to the top, drag heavy up, medium up, and now light is at the bottom. All of these are above the actual rendering. I'm just going to work my way from the top down. So let's start with the outline layer. The easiest way to select everything on that layer is just to click this little circle to the right that selects my layer. And I'm going to go to my stroke and change it to 3. All right, starting to look a little better. Let's go to heavy. I'm going to grab that and I'm going to change it to, we'll say 1.5. Just type that in. All right, starting to look better. Let's go to medium. I'm going to leave that at 1. And, well, maybe let's go to 0.75. Just a little bit lighter. And then we'll go to our light layer. We'll select that, and we'll change it to 0.3. So how do I know what thickness to change my layers to? Honestly, it's a lot of experience, and it's a lot of trial and error. There's no right way to do it. Every drawing is going to be different. What you really want is to be able to read a hierarchy. That's all that matters. And the hierarchy happens from having the heavy, medium, and light. The proportions of those can be different. I've already done this drawing, obviously, so I've kind of tested what was working well. Let's see, it was 3, 2, yeah. So I was able to just decipher what exactly is the best line weights here. So now we can see, all right, so our line weights are sort of good, but it's still a little bit muddy. I'm losing some line weights. I can't tell where my section is. The next thing I want to do is actually adjust the underlay rendering. So I'm going to unlock that layer, select that, select my circle to select the entire layer. I'm going to go to transparency, and I'm going to change the opacity. So if I change this to 0, now we have a full-on line drawing, right? Which actually, you can start to see that hierarchy that I set up in my my line weights is reading pretty strong here. But this is, it's just sort of a different drawing, a different style. What we want to do is a hybrid drawing. So we want to keep that rendering in there a little bit. So if I start to click it back here, you can see the line weight is dominant. But if I go over here, now the rendering's dominant. What I want to do is find that perfect balance. So if I drop this to about 70%, we're getting to a spot where the line weight is definitely dominant, but just by a little bit. So we're keeping some of that shade and shadow and materiality of the rendering in play here. So I think that looks pretty good right there. Now let's work on getting my ground plane and the section cut to really pop here. So this part is a little tricky, but once you do it a couple of times, you'll start to get the hang of it. So I'm going to select my outline layer, select everything on that layer, and I'm just going to hit K, and K is going to activate Live Paint. So if I'm just in Illustrator, hit K, now I've activated this to Live Paint. You can see it says click to make a Live Paint group. So I'm just going to click on it. Now I have a Live Paint group, and what this allows me to do is sort of paint bucket in everywhere I see. So I'm hovering around. I can either paint bucket the whole living room, or I can paint bucket all the walls. And so it's going to paint bucket my colors here, and this is not what I want. I actually want my section cut to be white and my walls to be black and the stroke to be 3. So now if I just click inside of my walls, you can see it paints in all that little thing. So I didn't have to paint, I didn't have to draw anything. I drew my lines in Rhino so that I could just paint bucket it in Illustrator to give this nice clean look. If I wanted to be careful, I'd come in and hit all these little, there's some structure up here. I'd come in and click all of those. But you can see I've just one click, I've filled in my entire section cut. And now for my ground plane, I'm going to change the color to just be a nice darker gray. I'll click in here, and now I've created my entire ground plane. So you can see how quickly we can just go from overlaying some lines to having a very clear line weight hierarchy and the section that pops by putting the color. So if we wanted to come back and change the color of that section, we can just select K again, change our color. If we wanted to, do something a little bit more crazy, very quickly, you can just paint bucket that section tool, and it can pop out in any color you would like. We'll keep our ground plane typically as nice and dark so you can see how the context fits into the design. And there we're basically done. If we kind of zoom in around on this a little bit, we can see that we have some nice crisp line weights, lots of fun detail in here to make you understand the space. But we have the rendering. While we reduced it to 70%, we're still getting this, it's generally lighter, a little bit darker up in the ceiling. It's really helping us to see a light side and a dark side to make that corner read stronger. We have some exterior information. We have a nice kind of subtle sky here to help all of this read and pop. But what's primary is the line work, and what's also primary is the section perspective, or the section most importantly. But we're also getting the depth of having this be in perspective. So it's a really powerful drawing to explain how your programs relate, how the section works, how facade materials and windowing relate to the interior spaces. All of that is done in sort of one drawing. So yeah, we'll leave it right there. Thanks for watching.